Hello, Dean.
Hi, Kevin. How are we doing today?
I'm doing just fine. How are you?
I am doing very well, thanks.
So, in these conversations that we've been having, I just want to step back just for a moment and just remind the people that are watching this, kind of what it is that we're doing and why. Um, for those who do know, they've seen some of our banter online on social media and things. But over the years, one of the things that we've both realized was that both of us have thought about a lot of different issues for a long time, and have gone into some level of detail to try to figure out what we believe about things, and have tried to do so in as intellectual or intelligent way as a person can. But we also kind of came have come to loggerheads with each other several times online, and very often we've come down on very different sides of different issues. And what we've realized is that it's more than just disagreeing on an issue, right? One of the things that we keep finding is that we're seeing things from very different perspectives, and that's one of the reasons why we're kind of calling this podcast asynchrony, right? Because it's almost like our worlds are not synchronous, or our universes are not kind of vibrating on the same wavelengths or the same frequencies. And would you say that that's probably a fair assessment?
Well, yeah, I mean, to summarize that, we've both made the comment numerous times that we live in different realities. And
Right.
part of what we're trying to do is figure out how that happened and why.
Exactly.
Which is kind of one of the things that led us into our current topic of, conspiracies and conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things that we identified, I think, is that people form their opinions based on what they're told. The stories they're given, the stories they believe. There are various ways that we do that, and kind of ways that we shortcut that. We find sources that we trust, and we just tend to some extent, blindly accept what the sources that we trust tell us because we trust them.
Right.
Um,
And we both
so
recognize the reality of confirmation bias, right? We both recognize that that's a very human thing, that people tend to believe, or they tend to value more generally those things that support their beliefs rather than conflict with them, right?
right. So when we talk about kind of in the second part of this conversation, I think we really identified what it is that we hope to accomplish with this conversation today is to kind of step back from analyzing the content of a particular theory or whatever, and find a way to uh, set up a template of analyzing, starting with looking at the structure of the argument, and are there that's why it's, kind of what's the difference between a conspiracy or a conspiracy theory, or, what is conspiratorial thinking, different things that we're looking at, so that we can then take that template later on as a form of analysis to look at, individual things, and try to help us determine, is there validity to this? Is it something that's going on that's, supposed to cause some kind of reaction, that type of thing.
Right, exactly. Yeah, because one of the things that we have seen, I mean, we can get into some specific, and we probably will dance on the edge of some specific issues and specific conspiracies, but that's not really the point, right? The point isn't to try to figure out, well, are you right or am I right on this particular issue, on this particular conspiracy, but rather, what is it that's leading us to come to the perspectives and the opinions that we have, and where are we really diverging, right? Where is that point where we kind of go off the rails as far as being asynchronous, right?
Yeah, I know, as I've been envisioning, this conversation today, I'm sure that there are topics that we'll raise as example, but we're not looking to explore those to find the validity of it. I think at least what I've been thinking, what I'd like to do is look at those, and, look at the argument, how that's presented, what we believe the argument is trying to accomplish, so that, we can then, like I said, explore that later on with other things. And I mean, some of those topics we may circle back to discuss in more depth, to see if
Sure.
we can find, the truth in those things. But
Right, but you gotta have the foundation first of understanding exactly why we're coming to certain, perspectives, certain positions in the first place, right?
Yeah, I think, for those of us who tuned in hoping to see us beat each other up, um,
You might be sorely disappointed.
yeah, the point of what we're actually trying to do is diffuse some of this hostility that we've
Right,
seen, that we've identified as being related to partisanship,
right, exactly, and kind of
and
preformed thinking or thinking that snaps to a certain template just because of that partisanship, right?
yeah. So, I mean, ideally, we'd like to explore the world outside of that and see if we can find, you know, deeper truth as opposed to, you know, doctrinaire opinion.
Right, exactly. And that's part of the problem with talking about conspiracies in the first place, right? Because one of the quotes that I came across in terms of looking at conspiracies and conspiratorial thinking is that, just showing people evidence is never works, right? When you're talking about conspiracy, because it's really not just about the belief is not about the evidence necessarily.
Well, one of the things that I feel like, we were talking last time about how conspiracy theory is used as a shortcut to dismiss the argument.
Right, exactly.
Um,
It's a pejorative term, conspiracy theory.
right. Calling
The person
something
who believes in it says it's a conspiracy. It's not a theory, right?
right. So, I mean, to some extent, we can see that it's clearly evident that what is happening is that whatever that theory is being strawmanned in order to be able to dismiss that. And the assumption is, the implication in that is that there's no evidence to support this conspiracy theory. The
Right,
average person knows without even thinking about it that this is not true.
right. Right.
So,
Like we've brought up in the past, like the flat earth theory, right? Most
right,
people are just gonna be able to just discount that out of hand and not even really spend any real time trying to investigate whether it's true or false.
right. But I think it was worthwhile pointing out. You told me recently that you had watched a documentary on
Yeah,
flat Earth.
behind the curve, it's called. Yep.
Right. I've not watched that yet. I'm very interested in seeing it, but I felt like that demonstrated a very important point because you said, and I think you were a little surprised by this, that the people who were promoting, that were seriously promoting a flat Earth belief, a lot of them were actually attempting to apply the scientific method and had
Exactly.
scientific evidence. And so, I mean, it wasn't just an empty, baseless argument.
No.
They were, they were attempting to do this in a disciplined way.
Yeah,
Um,
they were performing experiments. One of them even went out and bought a $20,000 laser gyroscope, right? Just to try to test the tilt of the earth theory, right? To see whether it was actually a ball spinning at a 15-degree angle.
right. And then, to be fair, you also pointed out that they found that the evidence opposed their theory and then came up with a way that
To
that didn't
discount
matter.
it.
Yeah.
Again, confirmation bias can be very, very powerful.
Right. And we're not getting too far into that, but I mean, the point is that you can't, I don't believe, dismiss any of these narratives without giving it a little bit of consideration because there will always be more actual evidence to support that than you believe if you don't know what the theory is.
Right, right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's always some. I mean, the most powerful conspiracies, right, or conspiracy theories, rather, the ones that are the most widespread in terms of their belief, or people who believe in them, have elements of truth. Even if the overall conclusion is false, there are a lot of elements that are true that kind of lead them in that direction.
Right. And a lot of times that comes out of, it's like my dark matter example from our last conversation. That comes out of holes in the, you know, like the widely accepted explanation that people are then trying to fill in with something that explains those holes.
Right.
So, I mean, the theories may not be accurate, but the holes are there. And just like dismissing the theories out of hand, one of the dangers that we have to recognize, I think, in this that we talked about is that if you just dismiss, especially for people who have gone and devoted hours and hours of research to this type of thing. If somebody just comes in and dismisses them out of hand without considering anything of what they're saying, what you're going to get is they're going to double down on their opinion,
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah,
and
and,
then
well, because these things become part of our self-image, don't they? I mean, our
right,
beliefs are a part of our self-image.
right, as like we pointed out, it becomes part of your identity. Um, Now, there were a couple of things that I had thought about looking at this. One, um, I think this is a bit of an oversimplification because I think there are more. I don't think that the flat Earth thing necessarily falls into this category, but you could almost make the case that there's really only one archetypal conspiracy theory. Is that there's a group of influential people that are trying to control the world in some fashion that is, you know, in opposition to what we're being told.
Right, there's
I mean,
some brain, like Pinky and the Brain, right?
yeah, I
There's
mean,
some
you can take this back hundreds of years because you've got, the Illuminati, the Bilderbergers, the Rothschilds, um, the Trilateral Commission. There's 100 different variations, but it's all a variation on the same theme.
correct, right.
So, you can almost use that template and lay it on top, because the flat Earth thing, like I told you, last time we talked, I mean, that struck me as weird as kind of a conspiracy theory, but the way that it was presented, it's, the Earth is flat is not a conspiracy theory. The scientists are lying to us and they have some kind of reason for telling us that the Earth is flat because they want to control us is a
Right,
conspiracy theory.
right, and
And it,
but they can't believe in the theory of the Earth being flat without believing that, right?
right. And that's where that tracks into.
they have to believe that there are governments and scientists and all these people in collusion, right, to spread a false narrative about the Earth being a round ball spinning in space.
Right, and at that point, it fits into the template that I just laid out. That's that cabal that's trying to rule the world that wants us to, see something that, whatever. Um, so I had a couple of, I had a couple of thoughts here, um, on looking at this. I mean, one of the thing, and this is one of the things that may make me more open to this type of thinking. I mean, first of all, it's kind of something that I've been fascinated with since I was a kid. I mean, I remember in the
The
'70s,
idea of conspiracies, you mean?
the idea that there's stuff outside of the accepted narrative or whatever you
That
want
you're
to
not being
call it.
told everything. You're not being told
Yeah,
everything.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's stuff that we're told that's not true, that there may be some, it's like I watched In Search of as a kid. I mentioned that to you, it's talking about Bigfoot, the Loch Ness monster, aliens, Project Blue Book as a kid that was on TV. And that's not to say that I believe in all of those things, but I'm also kind of open to, this there could be something there. So that I think that makes me a little more receptive to hearing, kind of some of these stories. Um,
Well, that
so
plays into the epistemic or the knowledge part of what leads people to believe in conspiracy theories, right? Because the world is seen as very complex, and I think especially now that we're being so overloaded with information, right? So such information overload all the time, 24/7, and it's very difficult. One of the things that I've done a lot to you when we go banter back and forth online is that I'll throw the old, Occam's razor argument at you, right? That then all things being equal, the simplest explanation is usually the correct one, right? But conspiracy theories actually play on our idea that it just can't be that simple, right?
well, see, I think the thread that they pull on Occam's razor in a conspiracy theory is okay. That's correct most of the time, but you're assuming that all things are equal and they're not.
Perhaps. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's, without getting into any examples, I think, it's like, okay, yeah, all things being equal, that could be correct. But, somebody's got their thumb on the scale, which goes back to the, people are doing this. Um, so all things
Right, but
aren't
that's
equal.
what makes the flat earth thing so interesting, right? Because I mean, it is so overwhelming in terms of the consensus, right? I mean, there are a lot of conspiracies like vaccine, conspiracy theories about vaccines and about voter fraud and things like that. That are pretty widely, there's a lot of belief in them, whereas there's not nearly as much consensus. Let me say it that way, as whether or not the Earth is round or flat, right? And that's what makes it interesting, that type of thing, because when you look at that type of conspiracy theory, in the sense that you're saying all these governments and all these scientific institutions are lying to us, that's a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
That's a large conspiracy. And of course, one of the things about conspiracies is the bigger they get, the harder they are to believe in, really. I mean, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. I mean, depending on what it is, it doesn't necessarily require as many people being in the inner circle as what you would think. But for something like that, for something like the earth to be flat, that yeah, that would require like the entire academic body and all of the governments, yeah, the scale of that is just, for most people inconceivable.
Right, right. But then, when you look at something like whether or not there was a conspiracy uh, to falsify the 2020 election, well, there's like 40% or so Americans that have at least some level of belief that there's some truth to that. But that's a big number, and it's almost as it's a big. It would be a big group of people that would have to be involved in that as well. Can you say?
I mean, it
But it's a lot
depends
more
on
difficult to find truth in that, right? Because
it,
it's the consensus is not nearly as overwhelming.
it depends on what the theory you went with on that is. And I don't think most people have an explanation as to yeah, I think most people who are like skeptical of the election results are just like that. I don't feel like that was the correct result. I don't think they've really drilled into this is why what I think happened and why. But, like when we talked about this last time, um, we both agreed that, you know, there's a lot more foundation for that type of argument to be made because we agreed conclusively that there is, manipulation and at some level fraud that goes on in every election. There's nothing that happens that, you know
Well, we
it
can definitely agree on the idea that there's no perfect election. We'll put it that way.
right. Right. So, I mean, if you accept that, it's just a question of taking that next step to say that this one, was actually influenced. Because I mean, there's errors and there's all kinds of things that goes on. So,
Right, but in the end, it's a choice, right? In the end, whether or not you believe it is a choice. And I mean, I think we can agree on the can we not, that believing in anything at some level is a choice, right? I mean, in the end, I don't believe personally that anybody can truly believe anything that they really, really don't want to believe at some level.
right. But I think this is I think this would be a good place to point out, when we talked about, what we were really kind of hoping to do, especially today, is come together and, we want to be able to transcend the partisanship and find consensus to look at greater truth. So one of the things that I was thinking, and I think that you agreed with me on this, is that we need to start out, in analysis of anything to try to kind of find a template that we can look, that we can lay on, my map transparencies from last time, lay on the argument to be able to evaluate the story prior to even getting into the content.
Right.
The thing that gets me on this, and this is, where I see like the partisanship, the back and forth and that type of thing. I mean, there was a big thing with the 2020 election, but you know, we also need to keep in mind that after the 2016 election, the losing candidate went on media and said that the winning candidate was an illegitimate president. Um, there was a lot of feeling from the losing side on that one that there was something wrong with that election. I mean, there was a story that he only got in office because the Russians interfered and it was a fraudulent election. So, I mean, that's not to analyze either one of those arguments, but to point out the fact that the same argument was made by each side, and then they're pointing fingers at the other side saying, but they're crazy.
Right. Right. Yeah, and we don't need to get into the specifics of that, obviously, as far as the comparisons back and forth, because there are a lot of differences, there are a lot of similarities as well. But the bottom line is that when you look at it, when anybody looks at either issue, they're going to typically run it through that partisan filter, right? And it's going to end up getting kind of shifted automatically towards one side or the other based on that perspective or that bias.
Right. And we're also going to run it through our confirmation bias. And
Right, exactly.
I'm I'm not pointing fingers at you or anybody else. I do this as much as anybody else, but what we're going to do is we're going to take the story that, if we're not really looking into it, we're going to take the story that confirms what we already know, and we're going to tend to believe that explanation of things.
Well, part of that, right, and part of any difference in beliefs is not understanding or not being willing or able to accept that other people could see it another way,
Right.
right? Because I mean, if it's if from the left perspective, there were a lot of people I know that woke up the day after the 2016 election was decided and said that just couldn't possibly be. People couldn't possibly want that, right?
Right.
And so the first thing you do when you realize when you decide that is you try to find other reasons why people would have been misin- misinformed, manipulated, whatever, right? You have to find these reasons why someone would make that choice. Um, even and especially those people that are kind of in the middle, the ones that really do decide things in elections, right? The people that go back and forth between parties.
Right. And I think right there really kind of identifies how a conspiracy theory comes to be. People get up, they look at the situation, whatever the subject is, they look at this and they're like, that can't possibly be right. Or that, there's something wrong in this that just seems wrong. And, you know, they're either told, no, that's right, shut up, or, that there's no acknowledgement of why people would think that. And so then you get people that create, well, okay, so why is that? What did happen? Who made it happen? And
Right.
then
And then a
and the
conspiracy is born. A conspiracy
ex-
theory is born. Right, exactly.
exactly.
Yeah.
Now, one of the other things that struck me in this is that it's it's really easy. Well, let me take a step back. Um, I've developed, I guess you could say, a certain amount of paranoia. I tend to look for how virtually any information that is coming to me is trying to manipulate me. Um, whether it's, trying to influence how I think or more importantly, influence how I act. Part of that's from having been trained in sales when I was younger. Part of that's from, having a psychology degree. So always thinking about how people are thinking and that type of thing. Um, So, I mean, that's kind of the perspective that I'm always coming from anyway. Um, so one of the things that I realized on that subject is that uh, we have a thing where it's really easy. If you change the name, you change the narrative. So, we can manipulate people through language. And,
Hmm.
there's an interesting example I thought of on that. Correct me if I'm wrong on this because this is my perception. Um, but it's like if somebody goes online and says something is a psyop, the immediate reaction to that, I feel like, is like, okay, that's a conspiracy theory. Okay. So
First thing that I think of.
exact. Okay. So I'm correct on that.
Hmm.
So let's run
I
through
think
a
so.
couple of things. Let's run through a couple of things. And I know you told me you just finished a book on propaganda. So, this may be treading some things that you run into. So we know the father of public relations was Edward Bernays.
Hmm.
Um, Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. We all knew who Sigmund Freud. Um, so Bernays developed his, his advertising. I mean, he's kind of the father of modern advertising. So he developed this technique utilizing the work of his uncle. So he's, looking at psychological techniques to get people to come around. And I mean, people can look up what he did. Um, the reason that we eat bacon and eggs in the morning is a result of, his work, the variety of other different things. We also know that his work was then taken by, um, the Germans in the 30s and became what we think of as propaganda. So what he did was to use psychology to help influence the thinking and therefore actions, in this case, getting you to buy something or behave in a certain way. Um, so, I mean, you would call that a psychological operation. So if you shorten that, if
Yeah, to psyop. I mean, when people say psyop, we're thinking of like some kind of military or CIA or some clandestine organization, right? But it doesn't have to be. It could be Madison Avenue, like you say, is
yeah,
what your argument that you're making.
it becomes a conspiracy theory. And I'm, not claiming anything about any particular argument there. I'm just saying that the way that you phrase it is going to give somebody a connotation, and that's going to influence their thinking too.
Right. But you said two things there that I want to zero in on a little bit. And one, when you were talking about that you tend to have kind of a paranoia, I guess is your word. Um, that seems to suggest that one thing that is always some characteristic of belief in a conspiracy, and I'm saying a belief that a conspiracy does in fact exist, not that it's a theory, um, is some level of distrust, right?
Right.
There's usually you're not trusting either the evidence or the sources of the evidence or the method that resulted in the evidence, right? There's something you're not trusting because you're not buying it, right? Um,
Right. And I
so
know.
that's one thing.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
And
and
what's
that's one thing that I think we could probably say there are different levels. I mean, some people are more trusting than others, right? We can agree on that, right? And maybe in some ways, when it comes to say believe in a government, for example, I would probably say I'm more trusting of belief in government in a ideal sense, right? In a theoretical sense, not necessarily our government or a specific government, but in government in general, than you might be.
right. Again, going back to the basis of evidence on any of these things, I think a lot of people have come to the beliefs that they have in various different things, um, based on the number of times they feel like they've been burned. Where they've found instances of, okay, what I was told isn't actually true. Um, which will then make them more skeptical the next time they're getting information from that particular entity or something that they see as related or whatever. So it's not that there's like no base. I don't think it's necessarily from a perspective of um it's solely based on differences in personality. I mean, I think there
You
are
think there's more
differences.
to it than that?
Yeah, I think there are differences in openness and that type of thing. But I mean, a lot of the thoughts that I've come to on a lot of different subjects have come from watching people that I believe have credibility, um, that have changed their own opinions on things and then explain what that process was for them.
Right, well, that
So
was one of the areas on that flat earth thing where there were several people that kind of went through that, where they talked about how they thought the idea was crazy at first, right? So you always there is part of that that goes on in the when you go down the proverbial rabbit hole, as it were, right? To believe in something that others might think is crazy or crackpot.
right.
Um,
Yeah, and just as a thought exercise, and I don't necessarily have a good answer for this either. Um, do you have any idea what it would take? And again, I don't believe that flat Earth is true. But do you have any idea what kind of evidence it would take to sway you to believe that there was some credibility to that? Because I don't know.
well, I mean, I would have to there would first of all, I would have to completely distrust and throw out my trust in a lot of different levels of sources, right? I mean, I would have to first not believe the scientists, right? And I would have to not believe. I mean, I would have to have some kind of reasoning that would give me the ability to believe that they are lying to me, right? So, um, I mean, that would be a basis. I'd have to start there, right? Because if I do trust science and I do trust scientists, um, and I'm going to get to more on that too in a minute, but then it becomes very very difficult when you can't find many real scientists that are out there, especially ones that have been on on the space station or that we trust have been on the space station, right? Because because those flat Earth people, they don't believe the space station's actually up there, right? So,
Yeah, I
they
mean,
don't believe we land on the
that's
moon. They don't believe that kind of stuff. They
I
can't
was
believe that because it
I was
destroys their
just
belief,
I was just gonna say that's another one is the people who disbelieve the moon landing. And
right?
I mean,
And that's a different level, right?
yeah, I
I
actually
mean, you can
watched some
believe in
stuff
that
on
and still believe that the Earth is round, but you
right.
can't. But you can't kind of do the other way around. You can't believe it's flat and believe in the moon landing.
Yeah. And I mean, I watched something recently, because I've always thought, well, I live near the space center, so I watch rockets go up into space
Right.
all the time.
They're going somewhere, right?
Yeah, so I'm like, okay, we have a space program. I mean, it's private at this point, but we've had a space program. They're shooting these things up into space. If this is all performative, y- they've
They
got
don't bounce off
astronaut.
the ceiling, right?
Yeah, if they've got astronauts on a soundstage somewhere that they're walking them, into the prop and then out of the prop when they get back, they're still shooting these things up somewhere and they're going somewhere. And and there's also too much evidence at this point that they're landing the boosters because I mean, I hear that it's loud when they land them on land. Um, so that was one that I'd really have trouble with. But I watched something recently on the idea that the moon landing was faked. And there are some legitimate questions that people raise that are like, okay, yeah, that's weird. I'd like to see an explanation in that.
Right, right. But I mean, if you don't buy into the conspiracy theory, you can always just say, well, that's just an epistemological hole in my knowledge, right? I just don't. There's just something I don't know that I need to learn
Yeah,
to answer
and
that question.
I mean, I don't know statistically, but I'm sure to get someone from belief in A to belief in conspiracy theory B, you have to check so many of those boxes that,
Right.
that it's destroyed the credibility of the original argument.
Right. Right. So you said that you thought it was more than just different personalities, right? Some people being more open or trusting or less trusting than others. And you said it goes more towards their experience and possibly their experience in having previously been burned. Now, one of the things that people often complain about, and one of the reasons why they will turn against science or scientists in particular, um, is because they're told one thing, like, that, whatever cholesterol, whatever is bad for you this week. And then the next week they find some other study that refutes that and turns around and say, and well, now it's good for you, right? Or whatever. And so is that kind of what you're talking about as far as being burned? Is like you've been told one thing and then all of a sudden they pull the rug out from under you and say, no, 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 that's not true. The other's true.
Yeah, and I mean that was actually one of the examples that I started to cite before that really became political. It was like, my example for that type of thing is like, okay, are eggs healthy? How many times throughout the course of our lifetime have they reversed that?
Yeah. And one of the conversations we talked about, discussing where the food pyramid comes from, right? And whether or not we believe, because there's a lot of questions about that, right, these days, right?
Yeah, and and that's become topical at this point. But there was questions on that. I mean, I remember 20, 25 years ago, the first time I encountered the Atkins diet, um, which, the medical establishment was like, "You'll die,"
Yeah.
you know, "If you do that, you will die." And then there was a lot of people that are like, "Well, I tried it and I lost a bunch of weight and I'm not on statins anymore. And my cholesterol and my blood pressure went down." And, so it's like that, they kind of lost control of that argument, I think. And I don't know if Atkins per se was, it kind of evolved into the keto diet or the low carb diet, a bunch of varieties on that. But I mean, it's interesting to see the evolution of that to where when I first became aware of that, it was considered, you know, fad diet dangerous to, a few years ago, my doctor gave me a recommendation that I need to be on a low carb diet to lose weight. So,
But that's one of the reasons why science takes it on the chin so easily, right? When it comes to conspiracies and conspiracy theories, is because science, by its very nature, is exploratory, right? And which means that people are going to make mistakes and they're going to come up with results that they think mean one thing, but then down the road they may learn more that basically says, well, no, it doesn't really mean that. It means something else. And it might mean something exactly the opposite.
and that's, and that is true. I'm not, not disputing that that's true, but that's also the argument that is advanced first generally to defend the status quo. Um, it's like, well, this is the progress of science. It's also a saying in a lot of disciplines of science at this point. I don't know if you've heard this, but they say that science, I believe was specifically applied to physics, but they said, we'll use physics. So physics advances one funeral at a time.
Yeah. But science also does have built into it its own kind of checks and balances, right? I mean, we have the peer review, right? And we have, journals that other scientists can come along and refute. And in fact, some scientists have made their entire careers by refuting major um quote unquote truths and showing their, frailties or their faults sometimes.
Right. So what if that scientist that is refuting the status quo runs into, to reverse one of your points, a situation where they're told 97% of science disagrees with you.
Right. Yeah. No, that's true. And that happens, right? That happens and very often if you find yourself on the 3% side of an issue, um, and I can't think of any specific examples right now where though they have necessarily been later proven true, but it can't. I can imagine that there might have been. Um, but at the same time, if you find yourself on that 3%, you're probably going to have a very difficult time getting hired by Harvard or MIT, right? Because 97% are going to include most of the people on those hiring committees.
Right, and as a matter of fact, if if your research leads you to that, um, you know, I've seen examples of this, and I mean, there's one that I'm thinking of, and we could look into it later. But if you're a Harvard researcher and you have a theory that agrees with the current consensus, and you decide to do research on that theory, and your research leads you to the opposite conclusion of what you went into it thinking, so you're doing science. When you try to publish that, it's possible that you could run into a situation where you're then discredited and potentially thrown out.
Yeah, it's possible. Definitely. Yeah.
So, you know, the point with all of that is that I mean, you can't necessarily shortcut based on, you know, any of that, based on consensus, based on the status quo, but it's It it is most likely going to be the case most of the time that somebody who's presenting a contrary idea, especially the longer it's been accepted and believed, um, they're gonna get pushback on. Uh, and that doesn't necessarily make it true, but it also doesn't always make it false. A lot of the times it bears at least worth potentially looking into to see if there's some type of substance to the argument. Or at least not dismissing it automatically that there's no substance to the argument. I think,
Right.
you know,
Right.
I think we would go there. And I mean, one of the things that in thinking about this, I was trying to differentiate looking at um, different ways that this is presented because I think we can look at these arguments and we can identify characteristics of the arguments that potentially fit patterns, which will help us to make some of those determinations. Um, So, I mean, some of the red flags that I came up with on looking at a conspiracy theory that could indicate to us that it may be a conspiracy theory, what we would consider something that you may need to be
Considered
skeptical of.
pejoratively. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Um, so, one of those was confirmation bias that it
Hmm.
provides confirming evidence of something that we already believe. It's like, no, look at this. This is what I thought, and this is what proves it.
Right. And we should be, and we could probably agree, we should be skeptical of that, if only on the basis of the old argument, if it's too good to be true, it might be, right? Kind of thing, where you should at least be skeptical of something just confirming everything you believe.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I try to do, I mean, I can't say I do this with any degree of, you know, accuracy or
Success.
anything. But what
Yeah.
one yeah, one of the things that I'm trying to do is that I try to be especially skeptical of things that I would like to believe.
Right. Right. I
So,
think
I
that's
mean,
I agree. I do the same thing. I do. I constantly question if it seems like, oh yeah, that's too convenient. Then that's the case, right?
right. So, the second thing that, identified in that, we kind of touched on this already, is that believing in this particular perspective grants you an identity.
Yes. It also
Um,
grants you membership in a
yeah,
group.
that identity grants you membership into a community.
Right.
Um,
And by the
now,
way, that same you can get excommunicated from that community whether you're a scientist or not, right? I mean, just believing in that flat earth thing gets you into that flat earth society, right? And once you become a part of that community, it's very hard to just turn your back on that community.
Right, and, I mean, there are some psychological things that are interesting in that I'd have to look into to get statistics and everything, but, we as people, we always tend to identify with the underdog. Um, culturally, we identify with the outcast. I mean, um, I had just finally gotten around to watching the 2 most recent, parts, the It movie that they had just done. Yeah, I had read the book when I was in college, so a long time
Mhm.
ago, really enjoyed that. I had not seen I had seen the
I've seen
original movie with Tim Curry, but I had not seen the new one. I'd seen the first part, but not the second part. And one of the things that struck me watching that as we were engaged in this conversation, you know, everybody's identifying with and rooting for the kids. The kids referred to themselves as the losers club. And this is a part of our culture that, we all see ourselves as the picked on, the outcast. We identify with that. And, so if you can find the community of the outcast, like the Flat Earth
Right.
Society,
Exactly.
you know, that there's a greater sense of belonging to that. Um, and
Absolutely. Oh, go ahead. Keep going.
one of the other things that I found interesting that is going back to something that that I had noted a while ago that you kind of really picked up on is that a lot of the times that community is not built up of people that saw themselves that way. That community grows out of people who have like investigated this, and then the other side has labeled them as that. So, so that I mean, they've been identified as the out group, the other, however you
Yeah,
want to
they've been
refer to
socially
that.
isolated. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, and there is, I mean, that's the psychological needs part, right? The psychological and motivational need part of believing in these kind of beliefs.
yeah, and a lot of times, and I think that's where you get a lot of the partisanship interconnection of different things. At this point, is you get a lot of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing.
Right. Exactly. It's interesting in that going back to that flat Earth documentary I was talking about. For those people who have looked at this, they'll know this name. The guy's name is Mark Sargent, and it's interesting because you can tell along with it's very centered around him, and because he's kind of like one of the leaders of this movement, of this group of people, this community. And, although he says he doesn't want to be the leader, of course, you can tell that he kind of enjoys it, right? It's really become a part of his self identity. And at one point, towards the end of the documentary, he actually even says, just flat out says to the camera, that, I'm so embedded and so invested in this community now that it would be really hard, even if I were shown proof that I'm wrong without a shadow of a doubt. It would be very hard for me to accept it and leave this community, right? I mean, the community is so powerful. That draw is so powerful that it is even more, at some level, more important to him than the truth.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that plays into one of the things that I've identified too. I think I've mentioned this before. Um, we are governed, or our choices are governed by our perceived incentives or subconscious incentives. And we always look at we're incentivized to be able to, we'll make choices that hopefully will enable us to be able to get what we want. But what a lot of people don't consider is the actual stronger incentive that we have is loss aversion. We don't want to lose what we have. We will
Right.
work twice as hard to
Absolutely.
maintain than we will be to advance. And
Yes.
and you get that in that community. And so once you're accepted into that community, you're going to do anything to stay there because you don't want to lose that.
Right. Right.
And
Yeah. And
and
it
that's
is part of who you are.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you adopt that and if you believe that as part of your identity, then, anything any accusation that somebody that will make to you that, well, you're not, you know You're not acting like part of the community. You're not part of my community.
Right.
And
Right.
and I think that's become a lot of our partisan discussion at this point.
Definitely. It's a huge part of our partisan discussion, but it goes to almost every other area as well. I mean, for example, just the fact that I'm the son of two college professors and married to a woman who's also the daughter of two college professors, and I've grown up around college professors my entire life because all my parents' friends were college professors, and you know what I mean? And because of that, I have an esteem and a membership really in a group of academics, right? And academia that makes me protective of that group, right? So when somebody attacks academia as being intolerant or or biased against alternative viewpoints and things, it's I have to stop myself from just knee jerk reacting to in defense, right, to of academia. And I
You're
in
you're going to have a lot higher bar than kind of the average person of anything that could change your currently held perception of academia.
right,
And I mean, logically, part of that is because you have a lot greater body of evidence to have given your perspective in the first place.
right. But you could say the same thing to someone who's been raised in a hyper patriotic or hyper nationalist upbringing, right? Because
Mhm.
those people have a very powerful vested interest in their self identity, as in believing in their country as being the greatest country that's ever been on the planet, right?
Right.
And so anybody that comes along and criticizes, like many people on the left are you know readily accepting to do, that criticizes areas, even when they do so in their own minds out of love for their own country, right?
Mhm.
They think they're criticizing it because they love their country, whereas the other person is going to immediately feel their self identity being attacked.
Right. And then, you know, what that makes me think of is that I think that your people who are going to have the strongest opinions, you're going to have a strong opinion, but your opinion would be even stronger, like I said, because you have a higher bar if something pushed you over the edge to distrust academia.
Right,
The, the
right,
convert has a much stronger opinion than somebody who's grown up in whatever belief system we're talking.
right, right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so one of the things, and those people who know me know my experience in politics and my good and bad experiences in politics. But and it did take for me, it took kind of a very bad experience in politics to from my own group, right? From my own side of politics to kind of in one sense wake up to those dangers, those partisan just the dangers of partisanship and overall. And then that gets has to be extended across the board, not to just partisanship, but to these other areas as well, and conspiracies and conspiracy theories and groups that are based on a belief in a conspiracy are
Mhm.
no different from that.
Right, right. So there was a third point that I had in what I had titled "Red Flags That a Conspiracy Theory May Be a Psyop."
Hmm.
Um, so the third thing, and we had kind of touched on this in our last conversation, is that the theory explains why something happened. It
Yes.
it creates a narrative as an explanation of you know there's this event. You identified this event as something that makes doesn't make sense. The explanation you've been given doesn't quite track, and then you're given a story as to you know why this happened, and that goes back to the why of it partially includes that the people that you are suspicious of in the first place are trying to do this to accomplish something.
Right. And what makes it powerful is that very often that why is for whatever reason, whether it's true or not, is constructed in a way that it fills those holes, right? It properly kind of fills those unanswered questions. And that answers that, again, that psychological need of, because nobody likes uncertainty, right? Everybody wants everything to be locked down. Right.
Right. So I mean,
It's uncomfortable. Uncertainty is uncomfortable.
yeah,
Ambiguity is uncomfortable at some level.
and looking at all of those, then together, so it gives you a why. It reinforces the perspective that you already had, and it gives you an identity that you can claim and a membership into a community. Um, I also looked at then to flip that coin. Um, I thought of some red flags that may identify calling something a conspiracy theory as being a psyop or, like an effort to discredit them. So one of the things we'd already pointed out was to straw man the theory by claiming that there is zero supporting evidence for the idea. Because I mean, you found legitimate evidence that people found in the flat Earth conspiracy. If you can find evidence that makes sense there, there's evidence that makes sense in everything. You know,
Right. Exactly.
um, yeah,
Well, I do
some-
think that that's one of the reasons why I like using that example, right? Is because it seems to most people so outlandish that it's hard to believe people would believe it, right? But then at some level, every conspiracy theory, if you think it's a theory, it's because you think it's hard for to believe someone would believe it. Again, it goes back to that same thing of we talk about, how in the hell does that person believe this? Right?
yeah, and it's I think I hadn't thought of this before, but I think it goes back to what we were just saying that there's a progression that goes through there because it's like most people start out believing the accepted you know story on most things.
Right. The consensus.
Yeah, the consensus, and so I think the evolution of believing what a lot of people consider a conspiracy theory starts with finding something that you know finding something that tells you that an aspect of what you initially believed isn't true. Find and then another one, and then another one, and then kind of the more that you look into that, and there's like we talked about, there's a threshold at some point where you've gotten enough holes poked in the original narrative that you've shifted your perspective on that. And the level, the threshold for that is going to be like we were talking about with you in academics, related to how, an individual's commitment to the initial, their initial belief. Because a lot of people are like open to different things. And, it's like, I'm not really invested one way or the other. So if you give me a couple of things that, tell me what I initially heard isn't true, it's like, okay, I can believe that. But, the farther you go down into, especially if it is, again, an aspect of identity or that type of thing, the more evidence is required to change somebody's mind.
Right. Right.
So, again, in evaluating arguments or trying to realize if there's, something else going on, the aspects that I've got that I thought were red flags, um, of trying to evaluate if this is an attempt to sway my opinion on this by calling it a conspiracy theory. As they straw man the argument with zero supporting evidence. Um, the expression of the theory provokes a a response which people feel, like personally would be disproportional. It's kind of like, what I had brought up last time about the COVID lab leak theory. And if you said that, you got kicked off the internet.
Hmm.
Um, it's like, okay, you could say that I was wrong. You can tell me why that doesn't make sense, but you just kicked me out of the conversation. So now I'm skeptical. So,
Right, because I
that's
mean, because like we said, I mean, these are people that have been socially isolated, and socially isolating them further is only going to drive them deeper into their into that belief structure.
right. So, so something like that kind of raises a red flag for me as to, maybe there's more to this.
Hmm.
Um, and then another thing that I found, um, you know, and maybe it would be better to look at these as just red flags on too quickly wanting to dismiss a conspiracy theory. Um, we don't need the conspiracy theory of people are behind this and they're trying to do something. It's just, um, for some reason we want this to not be part of the discussion. So the third one that I had on that was identification of one, finding something in the theory that is verifiably incorrect and dismissing the entire subject based on that one inconsistency. Because, I mean, people get things wrong. Like we talked about in science. I mean, if you look at the evolution of physics and quantum physics, I'm fascinated by physics. I'm not great at it. Um, but it's like you had Newton and you had a solid explanation for everything, and then you realized that it didn't always apply. And then you had Einstein who's like, okay, well, there's some more to this. And then you get into quantum physics where it's like, okay, all of those rules that you thought that you knew, none of them apply here.
None of them apply anymore. Right? Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So
And I
so
mean, you got going back even further. You got Copernicus, right? I mean, people were
right,
literally burned at the stake for being in the out group.
right. But you can't look at, the dual slit experiment or Schrodinger's cat and throw out Newtonian physics.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's you have to leave some room, and I guess this is the area where I think I have the biggest problem with conspiracies and the idea of believing in conspiracies is that it's almost one of my red flags on identifying them as as a theory rather than an actual conspiracy is when they seem to tie everything up too neatly, right?
Well, I
Right,
think that
because
goes.
it seems you need to leave some room for knowledge, some room for something you don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's the inverse corollary of what I just said. I mean, that goes
Right,
back
it
to
is.
in my red flags in a in believing a conspiracy theory is like if it if it gives you a why, if
Right,
it ties everything up neat,
exactly. It too neat.
then
Yeah,
yeah, you've got to be suspicious of that because you know you have to allow for inconsistencies, the potential for inconsistencies on both sides.
right. It's interesting because there is I find it ironic that one big idea in terms of conspiracy is that the use of conspiracy theories themselves is a manipulating tool, right? To control people and to if you can get them all believing this, if you can get them all disbelieving in science, for example, then being able to go out there and argue that we shouldn't have to reduce fossil fuels becomes much easier, right? Because you can get them if you can get them to distrust science. I mean, that's one thing that on the left people talk about a lot, I think, is get them to distrust science, then we can basically do whatever we want and convince them that they don't need to pay attention to this as a problem.
Yeah, I mean
So
that's
the conspiracy theory itself becomes a conspiracy.
and I mean, you can look at and this is where it gets really convoluted, but one of the things that you can look at as a potential course of action, you know, if you were part of a conspiracy and that conspiracy had some people that were starting to identify that, one of the ways that you could potentially derail that is to throw out, going back to my last thing that I just made by, throwing in inconsistencies, You could get somebody to promote something that was, like absolutely crazy, um, as a part of that conspiracy, and that quickly discredits the entire argument.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, and that's the thing. And again, this goes back to, kind of straw manning and not believing that there is any evidence. I mean, everything is not a false flag operation, but false flag operations exist.
Right. And everything is not a conspiracy, yet conspiracies absolutely exist. Right.
Right. And then, this will go back to a foundational thing that I think we can, will agree on multiple times going forward is that what we need in almost anything is a balance.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
there
that goes to the heart of when we discuss anything with anybody. Right. I mean, and this is we fall into this trap with partisanship immediately, but it goes way beyond just partisanship and just politics. But when we discuss anything with anybody, if we cannot at least start from the standpoint of giving each other the benefit of the doubt, that, for example, even when I talk to somebody who believes that the earth is flat, I should at least be willing to come to that conversation believing that that person is trying to find the truth. You know what I mean? Because that's difficult, right? Because you so readily don't believe what they believe that you think there's got to be something else to it, right? There's got to they're believing this for some clandestine reason that they can't possibly really believe this, right?
Well, and
You
a
have to
lot
trust.
of
You have to give people the benefit of the doubt to start with if you really want to find truth.
yeah, and a lot of people will get into the debates, you know, going back to that picking out one inconsistency and discrediting the entire argument. A lot of people do that in debate. It's like if I'm coming in, if I was coming into this conversation to try to point out why what you thought was wrong, I'd be looking at, trying to find those things that where you contradict yourself or where, you're pointing out something that I can begin to pick at as maybe not being, that's it's that lack of good faith. It's the, I'm trying to discredit you as a source of information as opposed to us working together to try to find good information.
Right. Well, that's what makes I mean, it's fun to talk about the flat earthers, right? Because in the end, their belief isn't really hurting us that much, right? I mean, it's a conspiracy theory that, um, I mean, it may be, I don't know, it may be hurting them in some respect, but it kind of isn't hurting society overall for there to be this group of people out there that believe this. Now, if it got to the point where the majority of people believe that, where we really did kind of fully beyond become like the movie Idiocracy, right? Where we believe in Soylent Green and all, this kind of stuff, then that could be dangerous, I suppose. That would definitely be dangerous. But where it does become really difficult is when it touches on things that could be dangerous if they're right or wrong, right? For example, when we talk about vaccines, and we're not going to get into that, right? As far as whether or not, the efficacy of vaccines or ineffectiveness or whatever. But if somebody believes that scientists have collaborated in a conspiracy to make us believe that vaccines that are not safe are safe, then and we don't give our children the measles vaccine, right? That could be potentially dangerous if they're wrong.
Right. Yeah. Both of those kind of relate to something that I've thought of as this is also kind of a foundational thing that I think people should keep in mind when evaluating information. When we're looking at anything, there is a cost and there is a benefit to virtually everything. And if you see an argument, a narrative put forth that frames something as being all cost and no benefit, or all benefit and no cost, you have to be skeptical of that narrative.
Right. Yeah. Yeah,
So,
I mean,
and that's going back to the flat Earth thing. Um, I don't know what the cost or the benefit in that narrative is.
right. But I mean, the problem is that if a mother definitely does not trust that the vaccine that she's been given to give her kid is safe, then she's not going to have her kid vaccinated, right? But at the same time, we can, I think, agree that I mean, it's difficult for me because I can't prove I'm not a scientist, right? So I can't prove that it's safe. I can't convince her of that. And even if I did have the absolute facts and I showed her all the evidence and all the research studies and everything, like she's probably still not going to believe that, right? So, I mean, she's made her decision. But we can agree that in those areas, I think we can agree. I hope that in those areas where it could be potentially dangerous for others, that maybe we should have rules that keep us apart, right? Keep that kid out of my public schools that where my kids are going, right? For example, so that my kids
So
don't get the measles.
I've got a couple of things that I could point out, but let's table this discussion, and I think we could probably do an episode on vaccines because this is one of
Yeah,
those things where, you know, 6 years ago, 10 years ago, I was exactly in the same position that you are. We would have been
right,
totally simpatico on that, and I've been presented with a lot of different, aspects of evidence that have come to lead me to have a lot more questions.
right. And we can table the specific discussion about vaccines because that's a whole nother ball game and would lead us down a entirely different discussion.
Right, and that's one of those things. There's a wide variety of positions in that. You've got the position from, and again, my cost and benefit thing. You've got one side that says, you know, all vaccines are great and there's no downside, to the other position that's gotten to the point of all vaccines are bad and there's no upside. And I think we can both agree that neither one of those positions is, like, really accurate.
Well, I will go so far as to say I don't know whether they're accurate, and I can't prove to you whether they're accurate. I'll put it that way. I'll say I have to leave some room for doubt, in my own belief,
Mhm.
right? Um, and and I think that's maybe where we can find some level of baseline agreement because in the end, there are going to be subjects, and vaccines may simply be one of them, where we can't find 100% synchrony, right? I mean, at some
Yeah.
level, there may be some level of asynchrony, and it's not necessarily uh, bad if we can learn to figure out a proper way to live with that asynchrony um, in a mutually beneficial way.
Well, and I think, and we may wanna do an episode on that, and I think that the benefit on that would be just to begin to break down kind of how to analyze that information as it comes in and, you know, figure out, what you need to pay attention to, what you need to disregard. Is there validity to this? Look at, trying to find what the accurate information in that is. Um,
Yeah,
and
I
I
mean,
think we've
maybe
got
the
a
closest. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think we've got a lot of space in our conversation going forward in doing that type of thing. And, want to kind of loop back to what we were hoping to do today. And I think we've gained a lot of ground on this, is to start by kind of framing a way to begin to look at these things so we know what to look at and how to analyze.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, because I think in the end, one of the problems with discussing if we were going to go into a discussion on any specific conspiracy theory and try to investigate whether it should remain a theory or whether we should agree that it's a conspiracy, uh, any discussion like that at some level usually ends up just pushing each other into further into our pre-existing beliefs, right? And so, but I think we can both agree that's not really beneficial. That's not really productive. what is productive is, I think, two things. If we can set the goal not on convincing the other one of our position, right, making it a zero sum game type of relationship, but looking at it from a twofold standpoint of at least understanding the basis of why that person has come to that position, right, and also coming to some acceptance or admission, really, that there may be some room for doubt that we should leave in our own belief.
Yeah, you know, I know my goal, my dream objective that I've had, in engaging with you over the years online has not been that I could convince you that I'm right. It's been that we could get to some point on a particular topic that you would say, "Okay, I still disagree with you, but I understand how you got there." That's all I'm looking for.
Yeah, well,
And
it's the old thing we've talked about before, like, Daniel Dennett said famously where, you need to be able to make the other person's argument as well as they can if you wanna argue about anything.
right, right. And I mean, I also want to, I know we've talked about this, but I want to reiterate this to anybody listening. I am also just as interested in finding out if there's anything that I've been led to believe that isn't correct. You know,
Right.
I don't, I
Exactly.
don't want to hold on to beliefs that are wrong. So, you know, like we talked about, there's going to be various thresholds in trying to get over that. But, I'm also interested in, walking away knowing that, um, what I'm thinking has a greater chance of aligning with reality.
Right. And with on that note, I think, this is probably a good place to end it because on that note, at least, we probably are about as in synchrony as we're ever gonna get.
Right.
Well, this is great. Let's keep the conversation going and see how we can get these wavelengths to match up as close as possible.
Sounds great. Really appreciate it as always, and already looking forward to next week.
All right. Have a great week, and we'll talk again soon.
You too. Thanks.